As the sun sets over the jagged coastlines of the Musandam Peninsula, the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, once the world's most vital energy artery, have become a graveyard of strategic assumptions. What began on February 28, 2026, as Operation Epic Fury, a campaign the Trump administration promised would be Iran's worst nightmare, has transitioned into a humiliating stalemate that military analysts are now calling America's Suez moment. The day the blockade failed was not marked by a single explosion, but by a series of tactical retreats, digital blackouts, and a fundamental shift in the cost-exchange ratio of modern maritime warfare. This definitive account explores how the world's most powerful navy found itself lulled into a trap by a mosquito fleet and why the maximum pressure campaign at sea effectively ended the era of maritime hegemony. The conflict erupted under a cloud of unprecedented technological optimism when joint U.S. and Israeli forces launched a decapitation strike that successfully assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and neutralized much of the Artesh, Iran's conventional military. The initial phase focused on degrading missile infrastructure, air defenses, and conventional naval platforms using strategic and operational deception. The tactical centerpiece was the F-35C Lightning II, with aircraft from the Black Knight Squadron orbiting the Iranian island of Qeshm for hours, mapping every vehicle movement and tunnel entrance in real time. This two-way mirror allowed U.S. forces to strike with 4-meter precision, leading Washington to believe that Iran's ability to resist was neutralized within the first week. However, this technological delusion ignored the distinction between a simple military problem and a wicked geopolitical one. While the conventional fleet of Iran was resting at the bottom of the Gulf, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps transitioned to its pre-planned Mosaic defense, a decentralized asymmetric doctrine specifically designed to bleed a superior naval power through friction and attrition. The day the blockade began to fail was characterized by a total collapse of maritime visibility. As U.S. destroyers entered the strait to enforce Project Freedom, they were met not with missiles, but with a massive digital blackout. GPS jamming and signal spoofing turned the world's busiest oil route into a massive tanker jam. Captains reported their navigation systems showing false positions, making massive tankers appear to be sailing over dry land or anchored at international airports. Over 1,100 civilian tankers were caught in this digital fog, making the 33-kilometer-wide strait impossible to navigate safely. This electronic warfare served a dual purpose. It blinded the high-tech sensors and AI-driven guidance systems upon which the U.S. Navy relied, and it created information uncertainty. Market participants could no longer distinguish between genuine supply losses and vessels that were simply electronically invisible. By the time the Qatari LNG carrier Mizam was forced to disable its tracking transponders to navigate the enforcement zone on May 11, the world realized that the U.S. could no longer provide a credible security guarantee for global commerce. The strategic failure was further cemented by the Mosquito fleet, a swarm of inexpensive, lightly built, and highly mobile fast-attack crafts. While the U.S. established conventional dominance, destroying more than 150 Iranian vessels, it could not translate that into battlespace control. The IRGC deployed thousands of these crafts, often blending them with civilian traffic to saturate Aegis defensive systems. The result was a mathematical impossibility for the Pentagon's budget. Washington found itself in a trap where it was expending $15 million interceptors to neutralize $20,000 Iranian kamikaze drones. Simulations suggested that at this rate, the U.S. would exhaust its entire stock of precision munitions in less than 4 weeks. This cost-exchange ratio proved that geography remained destiny. The narrow navigable channel of the strait forced U.S. capital ships into a confined space, likened to a boxer in a telephone booth, where they could not utilize their speed or standoff protection. The operational center of gravity that ultimately broke the blockade was the Iranian mining campaign. Iran utilized smart mines using non-metallic components to evade sonar and magnetic or acoustic triggers to inflict catastrophic damage. Tehran's masterstroke of psychological warfare was the claim that it had lost track of certain mines, creating a permanent, uninsurable hazard that modern mine countermeasure technology could not quickly neutralize. For decades, the U.S. had neglected its mine-clearing capabilities, and the failure of proven systems on the littoral combat ships left the U.S. Navy with no tools to secure the seabed. On May 4, 2026, the Trump administration launched Operation Project Freedom to break the closure, but it was abruptly paused after only 2 ships passed. The inability to guarantee the safety of the underwater corridor against unmanned underwater vehicles and smart mines marked the definitive end of the attempt to force the strait. The day the blockade failed was also the day the global economy realized the dual blockade was the new permanent reality. While the U.S. Navy blockaded Iranian ports, Iran effectively blockaded the entire Persian Gulf. The impacts were systemic and devastating as Brent crude surged to over $126 per barrel, with some intraday peaks hitting a record $166. Japan, South Korea, and India, which rely on the strait for the vast majority of their crude, faced acute supply shortages. Urea prices surged by 70%, triggering a fresh wave of global food inflation. Marine war risk insurance premiums spiked by hundreds of percent, causing freight markets to seize as shipowners refused to risk $100 million assets for short-term profits. In Pakistan, the crisis pushed diesel prices above 414 rupees per liter, eroding the purchasing power of the middle class and forcing merchants to airlift groceries as food supplies dwindled. The case of the Iraqi supertanker Agios Venurios I provided a stark study in the failure of U.S. security guarantees. Despite having already cleared the strait, the vessel reversed course upon approaching U.S. naval enforcement positions. The turnaround was not compelled by direct military action, but by the deterrent weight of the chaotic operating environment and the inability of the U.S. to guarantee safety against asymmetric threats. This incident illustrated that the U.S. had lost the ability to provide credible protection even to non-Iranian vessels, imposing massive economic costs on sovereign producers outside the conflict. One of the most persistent legacies of the failed blockade is the rise of dark shipping. To navigate the choke point, vessels are increasingly deactivating their tracking systems and disappearing from commercial monitoring. This practice has severely degraded the accuracy of real-time cargo flow intelligence, forcing insurance underwriters to price risk conservatively across the entire region. U.S. strategy was built on the assumption that military pressure would lead to regime collapse or a popular uprising. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The assassination of Ali Khamenei did not trigger a collapse, instead, it activated institutionalized succession mechanisms. Mojtaba Khamenei emerged as the new supreme leader, backed by a tier of IRGC commanders who transformed the Islamic Republic into a resilient barrack state. By the time the Islamabad talks collapsed in April, it was clear that Iran's threshold for pain was significantly higher than that of the American taxpayer. While President Trump extended the ceasefire unilaterally, the IRGC ignored the move, stating that any truce was meaningless as long as the port blockade remained in force. The internal fragmentation of the Iranian elite created a contested command structure that increased the unpredictability of the conflict. The failure of 2026 mirrors several historical warnings that Washington chose to ignore. Analysts point to Napoleon's continental system, where a massive blockade led to unprecedented smuggling and a breakdown of international consensus. Others compare it to the Vietnam War, where reliance on quantitative data and heavy bombing failed to break a resilient national will. Most poignantly, the crisis represents a reversal of the 1956 Suez Crisis. In 1956, the U.S. acted to halt escalation. In 2026, it was the primary driver of an offensive that lacked international consensus. The inability of the U.S. Navy to secure a narrow waterway against a middle power signaled a structural decline in maritime hegemony, proving that the era of megafleets imposing imperial will is over. The ultimate outcome of the failed blockade has been a strategic windfall for America's rivals. Russia, already a major supplier to India and China, saw its oil revenue surge by over $6 billion as global prices remained elevated, effectively subsidizing its own geopolitical interests. China, by coordinating transits with Iranian authorities and assessing payments in yuan, positioned itself as the silent broker of the Gulf, exposing the limits of U.S. coercive power. Traditional allies like Britain and Spain refused to support the blockade, while Saudi Arabia denied the U.S. the use of major airbases for offensive operations, fearing retaliation against its own energy infrastructure. This shredded the long-standing security guarantees that had underpinned the regional order for decades. As of mid-May 2026, the Strait of Hormuz remains contested, uninsurable, and a monument to the limits of military might. The U.S. Navy maintains dominance on the surface, having destroyed the bulk of Iran's conventional fleet, but it lacks control of the battlespace. The day the blockade failed was the day the world learned that a technologically proficient middle power could hold the global economy hostage using radio waves, cheap drones, and smart mines. For the United States, it is a great power inflection point, a retreat from maximalist aspirations in favor of an inconclusive and humiliating peace. Iran's worst nightmare may have begun with the death of a leader, but it ended with the death of an era, the era of undisputed American maritime hegemony in the Persian Gulf. Sustaining heavy damage to a carrier and exhausting critical munition stocks has forced a retreat toward a negotiated settlement, proving that geography remains destiny in the world's most critical choke point.